Imagine you built your entire life on one word: loyalty. Imagine you gave that word everything: your youth, your conscience, your hands, your soul. And then one day, the organization you gave everything to took your sons, not metaphorically, your sons, murdered by the same men who called you brother. What do you do when the thing you were loyal to becomes the thing that destroys you? Most men in that position stayed silent, took the grief, buried it, called it the price of the life they chose. One man did something that had never been done before. He talked, and when Tommaso Buscetta talked, the most powerful criminal organization in the history of the modern world began to fall. This is his story. Tommaso Buscetta was born on July 13, 1928, in the Porta Nuova district of Palermo. Not a wealthy neighborhood, not a powerful one. A neighborhood of glassworkers, artisans, families who had been poor for generations, in a city that had been occupied for centuries. He was the 17th child of a glass worker named Benedetto Buscetta, 17th, in a Sicily where the state offered nothing to families like his, where justice was something that happened to other people, where power belonged to whoever could take it and keep it. A boy growing up in Porta Nuova learned very quickly that the rules of the official world did not apply to his world. The Mafia was not something you read about in newspapers. In Porta Nuova in 1940, it was the street, it was the neighborhood, it was the men your father respected, the men who resolved disputes, the men who provided what the government would not. Buscetta was not recruited into the Mafia. He grew into it, the way you grow into the language of the place you are born. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had been formally initiated into the Porta Nuova Mandamento, one of the most powerful territorial units of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. He was not a soldier. He was not muscle. He was something rarer and more dangerous. He was charming, intelligent, politically astute, a man who understood that power in the Mafia was not about how many men you could hurt. It was about how many men trusted you. To understand what Buscetta was breaking when he talked to Falcone, you have to understand what he had sworn when he joined. The initiation ritual of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra had never been described by a member to an outsider before Buscetta. He described it to Falcone in precise detail. The new member is brought into a room with the existing members of his mandamento. He is told the rules. Never betray a fellow member. Never covet another member's wife. Never steal from the organization. Never cooperate with law enforcement. Then a saint's image, typically the Archangel Gabriel or the Madonna, is placed in the new member's hands. It is set alight. The burning image passes from hand to hand as the new member swears his oath. As long as this flesh burns, so burns my soul. If I betray Cosa Nostra, the fire, the flesh, the oath, three things that cannot be undone. Buscetta described the feeling of that moment to Falcone decades after it happened. He said it was real, not performance, not theater. Real, the community of men around him in that room, the weight of the oath, the fire in his hands. It meant something. It was supposed to mean something forever. That is what makes what the Corleonesi did so devastating to men like Buscetta. They did not just murder his family. They desecrated the oath. They made the fire meaningless, and a man whose entire identity was built on that fire had nothing left to protect with his silence. Through the 1950s, Buscetta's reputation grew, not as a killer, though he was capable of violence when the life required it, but as a connector, a diplomat, a man who could walk into any room in the Sicilian underworld and be received with respect. He traveled Brazil, the United States, Canada, at a time when the Sicilian Mafia was establishing its international networks. Buscetta was one of the men building those bridges. He understood something most of his contemporaries did not. The future of the Cosa Nostra was not in Palermo alone. It was global. Heroin was changing everything. The international narcotics trade was generating money on a scale that the traditional mafia economy of protection and local extortion could not compete with, and Buscetta was at the center of it. By the early 1960s, he was one of the most connected and most respected figures in the transatlantic drug trade. A man of honor, they called him. Uomo di rispetto. In the language of Cosa Nostra, that was everything. It meant you had earned a place at the table, that your word was your bond, that the code you lived by was absolute. Buscetta believed in that code, genuinely, deeply, in a way that would eventually cost him more than he could have imagined when he was young and rising, and the world felt like it belonged to men like him. To understand what Buscetta lost, you have to understand what he had. Not just money, not just power, a life. He married 3 times, had numerous children, moved between continents with the ease of a man who belonged everywhere, because the organization he served had reach everywhere. He was not the stereotypical mafia figure of Hollywood imagination. He was cultured, well-dressed, spoke multiple languages, could sit at a dinner table with politicians and businessmen and be indistinguishable from a legitimate man of the world. That was his gift and his danger, because men like Buscetta were not just useful to the mafia, they were essential to it. He represented something the Cosa Nostra needed desperately in an increasingly scrutinized world. A face that did not look like a criminal, a voice that did not sound like violence, a man who could conduct the most serious business of organized crime while appearing to the outside world like a successful international businessman, which is exactly what he was and exactly what he was not. There is something about Tommaso Buscetta that the history books rarely mention. He was not just a man of violence and power and silence. He was a man who loved deeply, repeatedly, sometimes destructively. His first wife, Melania Cavallaro, gave him his first children, but the Mafia life is not a life that holds marriages together. The absences, the secrets, the danger that follows you into every room of every home you try to build. His second wife, Vera Girotti, was Italian. She gave him more children, more family, more of the domestic life that Buscetta, despite everything, genuinely craved. There is a contradiction at the heart of men like Buscetta that is easy to miss if you only look at the crime. They wanted what everyone wants: a table with food on it, children who laughed, a woman who knew them and stayed anyway. They pursued those things inside a world that made them impossible. And then there was Cristal Marques de Almeida, Brazilian, young, beautiful, and completely aware of who she was marrying. Buscetta met her in Brazil in the years when he was, technically, a fugitive, living under a false name, building a new life on top of the ruins of the old one. She married him anyway. And when the Brazilian police arrested him in 1983, when the strychnine did not kill him, when he was extradited and disappeared into the machinery of Italian justice and then American witness protection, Cristal followed. She left her country, her family, her language, her identity, to live under a false name in a country not her own, beside a man who the most powerful criminal organization in the world was actively trying to kill. She stayed through the testimony, through the murders of his family, through the death of Falcone, through the years of hiding, through the cancer, through the end. When Buscetta died in 2000, Cristal was beside him. History remembers Buscetta as the man who broke the Mafia. Someone should also remember the woman who chose to stand next to him while he did it. The 1970s changed everything. Heroin had made the Cosa Nostra extraordinarily wealthy, and extraordinary wealth in an organization built on hierarchy and territorial control creates one inevitable outcome: war. The Second Mafia War began in earnest in 1981. On one side, the Corleonesi, led by Salvatore Riina, a man from the interior of Sicily, brutal, strategic, without the traditional respect for the old codes and courtesies that men like Buscetta had built their understanding of what the Mafia was supposed to be. Riina did not want a seat at the table. He wanted the table, and he was willing to destroy everyone sitting at it to get it. The Corleonesi began a systematic elimination of their rivals, not just the bosses, not just the soldiers, the families, wives, brothers, sons. The old code said, you did not touch a man's family. Riina tore that code apart and used it as a weapon. Buscetta was in Brazil when it started, but the war found him anyway. Buscetta's son, Benedetto, is murdered in Palermo. Then his son, Antonio. Then his brother, Vincenzo. Then his brother-in-law, his nephew, his son-in-law. In the space of 2 years, Tommaso Buscetta lost more than a dozen members of his family to the Corleonesi. Not enemies, not rivals. His family, the men he had grown up with, the men whose children played with his children, the men who shared his name and his blood and the world he had built. Gone, murdered by the organization he had given his life to, by men who called themselves men of honor. Buscetta was arrested in Brazil in 1983. He attempted suicide by swallowing strychnine while in custody. He survived, and in that survival, something shifted. A man who had lived his entire adult life by the code of silence began to ask himself a question he had never allowed himself to ask before. What exactly am I staying silent for? He was extradited to Italy in 1984. Waiting for him was a judge named Giovanni Falcone. Giovanni Falcone was not like other prosecutors who had tried to penetrate the silence of the Cosa Nostra. He was not interested in individual crimes or individual convictions. He wanted to understand the entire architecture of the organization, how it was structured, how it made decisions, how it moved money, how it enforced loyalty. He wanted to understand Cosa Nostra the way you understand a living organism, from the inside. And Tommaso Buscetta was the inside. Their first meeting changed Italian legal history. Buscetta did not break under pressure. He did not trade information for a lighter sentence the way informants typically did. He made a choice, a deliberate, considered, moral choice. He told Falcone that the organization he had served had betrayed everything it claimed to stand for, that the Corleonesi had destroyed the Cosa Nostra from within, that the code of honor was dead, and that he, Tommaso Buscetta, was going to tell the truth, not to save himself, but because the thing he had been protecting with his silence no longer existed. He said to Falcone, and these words have been quoted in courtrooms and history books ever since, "You will understand, after our conversations, that a part of me is dying." What followed was one of the most significant series of testimonies in the history of organized crime. Buscetta did not give Falcone names of individual criminals. He gave him the map, the complete internal structure of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the hierarchy, the initiation rituals, the decision-making process, the territorial divisions, the commission, the rules, the violations. For the first time, a man who had been at the highest levels of the organization was describing it from the inside in precise, verifiable, devastating detail. Falcone called him not an informant, but a witness. The distinction mattered enormously. Informants trade information for deals. Witnesses tell the truth because they have decided the truth must be told. Buscetta was a witness. His testimony became the foundation of the Maxi trial, the largest criminal proceeding in Italian history. 1986 to 1987, Palermo, a specially constructed bunker courthouse, 475 defendants, hundreds of charges, thousands of pages of evidence, much of it built on the words of one man, Tommaso Buscetta. 342 convictions, including 19 life sentences. The Cosa Nostra had never been hit like this, not by the police, not by the government, not by rival organizations, by one of their own. Buscetta's testimony did not stop in Italy. It crossed the Atlantic. The connection between the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and the American Mafia had been one of the most closely guarded secrets in organized crime. Two separate organizations, two separate codes, but one shared economy: heroin. The pizza connection had been the pipeline, a network of pizza restaurants across the northeastern United States used as fronts for distributing heroin imported from Sicily. The FBI had been investigating it for years. What they lacked was someone who understood both sides of the network, someone who had sat at tables in Palermo and tables in New York and understood that they were the same table. Buscetta was that person. His testimony to American prosecutors and later to a congressional committee in 1992 provided the connective tissue between the Sicilian operation and its American infrastructure. He named names that American law enforcement had suspected for years but could never prove. He described meetings in New York restaurants where Sicilian and American bosses divided territories and shipments and profits. He explained the hierarchy, the protocols, the language, the rituals that bound the two organizations into one functioning machine. The Pizza Connection trial resulted in the conviction of 22 defendants, but its significance went beyond the convictions. For the first time, American and Italian law enforcement had a complete picture of the transatlantic criminal network that had been moving heroin into American cities for decades. That picture had one primary source: Tommaso Buscetta. The Cosa Nostra does not forget. While Buscetta testified, while his words were dismantling the organization brick by brick, the killing continued. Members of his extended family who had survived the initial purge were murdered. His second wife's relatives were targeted. The message was clear: you can talk, but we will make sure that every word costs you something. Buscetta was placed in the American Witness Protection Program. He lived under a false name, in a location that changed regularly, surrounded by people who were not his people, in a country that was not his country. The man who had moved between continents with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere, now belonged nowhere. He continued to cooperate with American prosecutors. In 1992, he testified before a U.S. congressional committee on the links between the Sicilian and American mafias. In the same year, his friend, Giovanni Falcone, was murdered. A bomb planted beneath the motorway between Palermo Airport and the city. Falcone, his wife, 3 bodyguards, gone. 2 months later, another judge, Paolo Borsellino, who had worked alongside Falcone, was killed by a car bomb outside his mother's house. The Cosa Nostra declaring war on the Italian state itself. Buscetta heard the news of Falcone's death in hiding. The man he had trusted with everything. The man he had broken the most sacred rule of his world to help. Gone. Here is what the historians and the true crime writers and the documentary makers almost always miss about Tommaso Buscetta. He was not a hero. He never claimed to be. He was a man who had committed serious crimes, who had been part of an organization that destroyed lives for decades. He did not cooperate to make amends. He cooperated because the organization had violated its own code so completely that the code itself had become meaningless. He was not breaking loyalty. He was recognizing that loyalty had already been broken by the men he was loyal to. That is a crucial distinction. Psychologists who have studied the testimony of Mafia informants consistently identify a specific pattern in the most significant cases. The break does not come from external pressure. It comes from an internal recognition that the identity the person had built around the organization no longer corresponds to what the organization actually is. Buscetta had not joined a criminal gang. He had joined what he understood to be a society with rules and honor and a code that meant something. When Rina destroyed that code, he did not just destroy rivals. He destroyed the meaning that men like Buscetta had organized their entire lives around. And when the meaning is gone, the silence has nothing left to protect. 2 years before he died, Tommaso Buscetta gave what would become his final major interview. He was 70 years old, living under a false name, sick with the cancer that would kill him 2 years later. The journalist, Marco Travaglio, asked him a question that nobody had asked him quite so directly before. Did he regret joining the Cosa Nostra? Buscetta was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that has stayed in the memory of everyone who heard it. He said, "I regret that I believed it was something it was not. Not that he joined, that he believed." That distinction is everything. He had not joined a criminal gang in his own understanding of what he was doing. As a young man in Palermo, he had joined a society, a community, a world with rules and honor and meaning. The regret was not for the choice to join. The regret was for the belief that the thing he was joining was real. He also said, in that final interview, something about Falcone that has rarely been quoted. He said, "Falcone was the only man outside my family that I ever truly trusted." The judge and the criminal, two men from completely different worlds, finding in each other something neither could find anywhere else: honesty. Falcone trusted Buscetta to tell the truth. Buscetta trusted Falcone to understand it. When Falcone died, Buscetta lost the last person who knew exactly who he was and treated him as a man rather than an asset or a criminal or a legend or a traitor. He spent the last 8 years of his life genuinely alone, in a way that no witness protection program can protect you from. The loneliness of being known by no one. In Sicily today, the name Tommaso Buscetta still divides people. There are those who call him a traitor, a man who swore an oath and broke it, who sent his brothers to prison for life, who violated the most sacred rule of the world he had chosen. In certain neighborhoods of Palermo, that verdict has never changed. And then there are those who call him something else entirely: the man who saved Italy. In the years following the Maxi trial, Italian authorities, using the framework that Buscetta's testimony built, prosecuted and convicted hundreds of Mafia members. The Cosa Nostra never recovered its pre-1986 power. The pizza connection was dismantled. The transatlantic heroin network that had been flooding American and European cities with drugs for decades was broken. Judge Falcone, before his murder, said publicly that without Buscetta, none of it would have been possible. Not the Maxi trial, not the convictions, not the intelligence that changed how law enforcement understood and fought organized crime globally. One man's testimony. But here is the question that nobody answers cleanly. Was Buscetta a hero? He was a drug trafficker. He was an accessory to murders. He was a man who spent decades enriching himself through an organization that caused immeasurable suffering. He did not cooperate until his own family was destroyed, until it cost him personally. Is that heroism? Or is it simply a man who finally ran out of reasons to stay silent? Perhaps the most honest answer is that he was neither hero nor villain. He was human, deeply, completely, contradictorily human, which is the most uncomfortable kind of story to sit with, because it does not allow us the comfort of a simple verdict, just like the man himself. Tommaso Buscetta died on April 2nd, 2000, of cancer in the United States in witness protection under a name that was not his name. He was 71 years old. He had outlived most of the men who had tried to kill him. He had outlived the organization whose dismantling his testimony had begun. He had outlived the judges whose work his words had made possible. In his final years, he gave several interviews. He never expressed conventional remorse in the way that public figures are expected to perform it. He did not cry on camera. He did not ask for forgiveness. What he said was something more honest than either of those things. He said he had lived by a code, that the code had been real to him, that when the code died, something in him died with it, and that what he did in the years that followed was not betrayal. It was the last act of a man trying to honor something that no longer existed anywhere else except inside him. There is a version of this story that is simple. A criminal who turned on his organization to save himself. That version is easier to understand. It is also wrong. Tommaso Buscetta lost more than anyone who stayed silent. He lost his sons, his family, his name, his country, his identity, his freedom, his friend, his world. He gained nothing that the word informant typically implies. What he gained was something that cannot be measured in sentences reduced or deals made. He died as the man he had decided to be in that cell in Brazil after his sons were gone and the strychnine had not worked and the world he had built was ash. Not the man the Cosa Nostra had made him, his own man. For the first time in his life, that is not a simple story. That is a human one. This has been Prometheus. We stole the fire. Now we document the ash. And sometimes, in the ash, we find what the silence was always hiding. Not loyalty, just fear. And one man who finally was not afraid.